The mob surged across a Milan square in the final days of the war, roaring over the gunfire as society passed sentence on the dictator. Yet the fury of 1945 was born from a very different crisis decades earlier. In the early 1920s, the execution noise was preceded by the heavy silence of empty factories. The First World War left the nation fractured, with soldiers returning to shuttered businesses and soaring inflation. By 1921, 2 million Italians wandered the streets without any prospects for work. This deep social despair built the foundation for a new regime. Mussolini capitalized on this economic paralysis, and backed by popular frustration, he officially assumed the title of Il Duce. To enforce his new title, the dictator mobilized his followers. 30,000 armed blackshirts marched on the capital. By October 1922, this sudden mobilization paralyzed the government. King Victor Emmanuel III handed over state power to avoid a full-scale civil war. Order quickly replaced the street chaos. Streets became safe for ordinary citizens, and the national railways ran on time. But this outward stability demanded strict payment. The regime seized the press and dictated daily routines. By 1929, the government introduced a single mandatory textbook for all elementary schools. Citizens traded their intellectual freedom for punctual trains. Domestic obedience was only the beginning. By the late 1930s, Mussolini shifted his focus outward. He directed his military staff to draft plans for an African empire. These plans demanded the blood of hundreds of thousands of Italian conscripts in 1935. Young men boarded transport ships bound for East Africa for a dictator's imperial dream. Their target was Ethiopia, standing alongside Liberia as one of the last two fully independent nations in Africa. The invasion quickly escalated into atrocities against the local population. Italian aviation squadrons circled over the arid highlands, dropping canisters of sulfur mustard on undefended Ethiopian villages. Suffocating clouds of poison gas settled over the rural settlements, burning the lungs of anyone beneath them. Terrified civilians abandoned their homes. They fled through the valleys while international laws regarding chemical warfare were ignored. Emperor Haile Selassie fled into exile, traveling to Geneva to personally appeal to the League of Nations. The international community condemned the aggression and drafted economic sanctions designed to paralyze the invasion. However, the diplomatic response remained entirely superficial. The embargo restricted minor imports but bypassed the single resource necessary for military operations. Oil for the Italian war machine never fell under the League of Nations sanctions. Diplomatic fallout stripped Rome of European allies. The isolation of the mid-30s demanded a shift. By 1939, that lonely stance became a formal military bloc. It began with personal admiration. In 1936, two dictators recognized a shared vision for conquest. Their sympathy required a legal foundation. Wet ink dried on the pages of the Pact of Steel. This document cemented unconditional military obligations. A signature tied millions of ordinary Italians directly to Berlin. When the global conflict erupted, Rome hesitated. Early German victories altered the calculus. The nation declared war on Britain and France on June 10, 1940. Women stood for hours outside empty bakeries while military trains rolled past. The promised quick triumph unraveled, leaving a disaster not just in North Africa, but on the crumbling streets of Italian cities. The mechanical failure began on the battlefield. Frontline units marched with outdated rifles, while armored divisions relied on light Fiat tanks that caught fire under British artillery. When Greek forces halted the invasion across Epirus, the entire military supply chain shattered. This logistical collapse at the front immediately triggered widespread economic death at home. Heavy industries shut down their assembly lines without raw materials. By 1942, air raid sirens wailed over Rome and Milan. Allied bombers dropped high explosives that tore through residential blocks and destroyed municipal infrastructure. Soldiers rode home begging for food, only to find their families had nothing to send. Rationing started in 1941, yet basic calories completely vanished from the markets. The daily bread allowance for civilians plummeted to just 150 grams. Despite the hollow shelves and the threat from the sky, the state propaganda machine kept moving. Mussolini stepped to the microphone and continued broadcasting speeches about inevitable victory to a starving nation. Those radio broadcasts lost all meaning in the summer of 1943. The war finally reached Italian soil. 160,000 soldiers from Britain, the United States, and Canada landed on the shores of Sicily on July 9th. The exhausted Italian army offered little resistance. In just over a month, the entire island fell. Allied bombers appeared in the skies over Rome. Explosions shattered streets, and civilians fled the capital in mass panic. The shockwave hit the ruling elite. Survival required a sacrifice. On July 24, 1943, Mussolini convened the Grand Fascist Council. This body had not gathered since 1939. He expected loyalty. Instead, he faced terrified officials looking for a way out. They blamed him for the ruined cities and military disasters. The debate lasted for hours. Heavy wooden doors locked the council inside the Palazzo Venezia. Behind those panels, 26 men decided the fate of the country. The inner circle chose self-preservation. The final tally stood at 19 votes against 7. The heavy doors of the royal residence remained firmly shut on July 25th, while King Victor Emmanuel III issued a quiet directive. The internal council tally of 19 dissenting voices against 7 loyalists instantly became a formal warrant for arrest. News of the sudden dismissal leaked rapidly, triggering an explosive physical reaction across a nation of 45 million people. The familiar rhythm of military marches abruptly ceased, replaced by the ringing of heavy church bells over city rooftops. Crowds flooded the public squares. Ordinary citizens scaled the stone facades of municipal buildings to pry off iron fasces, tearing propaganda banners down into the dirt. Framed portraits were thrown directly from high balconies, shattering on the cobblestone streets below. 21 years of dictatorship vanished in a single night. Meanwhile, armed guards quietly secured their captive and drove him upward into forced isolation at the remote Hotel Gran Sasso. The forced isolation at the mountain retreat was meant to seal the regime's demise. Instead, the dictator's sudden fall brought foreign commandos into the nation, not peace. Isolation at the Gran Sasso lasted only a few weeks. By September 1943, Adolf Hitler ordered an immediate extraction to protect his military plans. The Gran Sasso Hotel sits over 2,000 meters above sea level. Hundreds of armed Italian guards surrounded the remote perimeter. German commandos, led by Otto Skorzeny, bypassed the terrain entirely. Their heavy gliders landed directly beside the hotel building, without a single shot fired. Skorzeny's men stormed the complex in minutes. They found the captive frail and confused. This swift operation erased the will of the Italian citizens. The country's destiny no longer belonged to its people. Berlin now held control. Within hours, a small German plane flew the former dictator out of the mountains. After the rescue flight, Hitler handed his former ally a new assignment on the shores of Lake Garda. Benito Mussolini sat in a requisitioned villa, holding the title of head of state. He signed daily decrees. He reviewed ceremonial guards. Yet the man dictating orders could not move a single battalion without a German officer's approval. The Italian Social Republic, based in the town of Salò, existed merely on paper. Berlin managed the territory. By early 1945, the illusion shattered against military reality. From the south, American and British divisions pushed up the peninsula. Distant thuds of Allied heavy bombing rattled the windows across Salò. In the east, Soviet armies tore through the remaining German lines, forcing the Axis front into rapid retreat. The phantom government collapsed. Northern Italy became a landscape of fresh craters. Bridges fell into rivers. Thousands of civilians walked along destroyed highways, pushing wooden carts. Behind the lines, the local bureaucracy dissolved. High-ranking fascist officials packed briefcases in the dark. They abandoned their lakeside offices. Some quietly surrendered to advancing patrols. Others secured transit documents and drove toward the Swiss border, 130 kilometers away. He remained completely alone. While high-ranking officials abandoned their posts and hurried toward Switzerland, who exactly took control of the streets in the northern industrial centers? Ordinary workers and farmers formed local combat groups to replace the retreating authorities. They carried captured weapons. They pushed out regular army divisions without wearing a single piece of standard military uniform. The resistance spent 2 years gathering strength, uniting different social classes under one goal. Factory mechanics organized tactical squads alongside university students and agricultural laborers. By the spring of 1945, partisan forces across the north had expanded to 100,000 fighters. Knowing the Axis front was collapsing, the command issued a directive for a general insurrection. Armed civilians forced doors open and occupied the main broadcasting stations throughout Milan. Groups of men and women barricaded key administrative buildings, aiming seized rifles from the upper-floor windows. Sirens wailed without pause, and loud shouts echoed across the heavy industrial districts. The uprising rapidly spread outward from Milan, overtaking Turin and Genoa within hours. The 25th of April became the point of no return. The news of the urban uprisings reached the headquarters in Salò. Milan was gone. There was only one goal left: crossing the border to neutral Switzerland. On April 25th, the dictator made his final move. He hastily gathered Cloretta Petacci and a small group of loyalists. The plan looked simple on paper. They would cross the Alps, step onto Swiss soil, and secure a flight to Spain. Franco's regime still stood there. Mussolini genuinely believed he could negotiate his safety in Madrid. But this political illusion crashed against the ruined asphalt. The fleeing group had lost all control over their own territory. Allied planes actively hunted military convoys from above. Retreating German trucks heavily choked the narrow mountain highways. Constant chaos consumed the traffic. Every single settlement along the escape route was held by partisans. This desperate attempt to bypass the blockades collapsed on April 27, 1945, near the small village of Dongo. For 2 decades, his confident features had dominated the public facades of Italian buildings. But today, he sat trembling in the back of a canvas-covered transport. To avoid capture, the former dictator wore a standard German military helmet and a heavy woolen overcoat pulled directly over his uniform. The convoy stalled near the shores of Lake Como, an alpine basin dropping over 400 meters deep. Fighters from the 52nd Garibaldi Brigade approached the halted vehicles. This specific combat unit consisted almost entirely of Lombardy locals, ordinary citizens who had spent their entire lives under his rule. They ordered the foreign drivers to cut their engines. Armed partisans climbed up into the crowded truck beds. They moved slowly down the wooden benches, carefully inspecting the faces of the fleeing soldiers. One fighter noticed an older man huddled awkwardly in the far corner. They grabbed his thick, dirty coat and pulled the nervous passenger out onto the provincial road. The oversized German fabric smelled of stale exhaust and road dust. Underneath the heavy steel helmet, they saw a pale, exhausted face devoid of its former arrogance. The local partisans stared in shock at the unmasked Benito Mussolini. Cloretta Petacci stepped down from the vehicle and took her place beside him in front of the armed crowd. Partisans moved the captured dictator and his companion to a secluded rural farmhouse. Armed men gathered at the stone walls in the village of Giulino di Mezzegra. Inside the locked bedroom, Benito Mussolini and Cloretta Petacci waited in silence. Outside, the local crowd debated. A formal court seemed entirely inadequate. 2 decades of dictatorship required an immediate physical response. Partisan commander Walter Audizio received the execution order directly from the National Liberation Committee. The mandate was clear. On the morning of April 28, 1945, the partisans finalized the decision to shoot them both. The partisans carried out their resolution on that afternoon of April 28. The time was 10 minutes past 4. Armed guards escorted the two prisoners down a quiet rural road toward a bare stone wall. They halted the procession right beside a set of iron gates. For over 2 decades, the regime had orchestrated grandiose state parades accompanied by thousands of marching soldiers. Now, the execution featured no final theatrical speeches, no military honors, and no roaring crowds. A dictator who once commanded crowds of over 100,000 at Palazzo Venezia met his end before a handful of locals. The designated shooters raised their weapons and fired their rounds at close range. The sharp sound of gunfire reflected off the facades of the nearby rural houses. Both bodies immediately collapsed onto the uneven dirt path beneath the wall. The echo of shots dissipated. The quiet execution in the countryside gave way to the noise of Milan. By the morning of April 29, 1945, workers, soldiers, and women streamed toward a single open truck in Piazzale Loreto. The vehicle carried the remains of Benito Mussolini, Claretta Petacci, and several top fascist officials. These were the same boulevards that once hosted thousands of marching black shirts. Now, the crowds pushed closer to see the fallen dictator. The location held specific weight. In August 1944, fascist forces had publicly executed 15 resistance fighters in this exact spot. The militia left their bodies on display as a warning to the population. The partisans chose this square deliberately. Thousands of residents surrounded the truck to deliver their answer. Years of trauma erupted across the pavement. People pushed past the armed partisan guards to shout, spit, and strike the bodies. Bullets hit the corpses. The crowd unloaded 2 decades of political oppression onto the remains of the regime. To make the bodies visible to the entire gathering, partisans dragged them to a nearby Esso gas station. Men climbed the steel structure with thick ropes. They tied the ankles of Mussolini and his inner circle. Partisans hoisted the bodies into the air and suspended them upside down from the canopy. The metal beams of the gas station roof squeaked under the shifting weight. The crowd below watched the swaying figures. This public degradation became a mass ritual of closure for the residents of Milan. Photographs of the suspended bodies went out to global news agencies. Images from the Milan gas station reached front pages from London to New York. Within Italy, the streets transformed. Previously, black shirts dictated public order. Now, citizens gathered freely without the constant fear of arrest. The physical dismantling of the regime began. Heavy metallic thuds echoed as crowds ripped fascist emblems down from stone facades. People erased 20 years of propaganda by smashing monuments. This purge preceded the military capitulation. On May 2, 1945, German forces surrendered to the Allies. Industrial centers like Milan and Turin lay heavily damaged, but the fighting stopped. The public then turned toward the institutions enabling the dictatorship. King Victor Emmanuel III faced a hostile nation. He had tolerated the rule for 2 decades. The public tied the crown directly to the ruin of their country, forcing the monarch into exile in Egypt. The state initiated a legal shift to sever ties with the past. Citizens cast their ballots in a referendum to abolish the monarchy. Italy proclaimed the Republic on June 2, 1946. The newly proclaimed Republic attempted to move forward, but the dictator's hidden remains presented a persistent, unresolved problem. Exactly 1 year after the execution, in April 1946, the corpse vanished. Under the cover of darkness, Domenico Lucchesi and his loyalists dug into the damp earth. They targeted the Musocco cemetery in Milan. The work was fast. They hoisted the remains out of the unmarked grave. The Italian state had chosen this secret location to deprive the remaining fascist supporters of a physical pilgrimage site. The plan failed. Instead, the hidden body transformed into a political artifact. A radical cult was already forming in the shadows of the new democracy. Domenico Lucchesi, a young veteran of the fallen regime, viewed the former leader as a betrayed hero. His group, the Democratic Fascist Party, treated the decaying corpse as a sacred relic. They wanted their leader back. They extracted the remains to rescue the last symbol of their defunct cause. The government realized it could not completely erase the dictator's legacy as long as marginal factions operated in secret. The theft triggered panic within the administration. Police immediately launched massive searches throughout the provinces of northern Italy.
For 11 years, the Italian government hid a corpse from its own citizens to prevent a national uprising. The massive provincial manhunt concluded in August 1946 behind the walls of the Certosa di Pavia monastery. Detectives descended upon the small religious complex, forcing a local monk to surrender the plain wooden crate. Authorities immediately seized the dictator's body and transported it to secure government vaults. They treated the dead man as a high-level national security threat. Bureaucrats feared that any formally marked grave would transform into a rallying point for surviving loyalists. The state locked the remains away in undisclosed government facilities, strictly refusing to release information to the public. The secret held. The situation remained frozen until the political landscape shifted and Raquel Mussolini demanded her husband's bones. After extensive closed-door negotiations, administrators finally yielded to the widow's persistent pressure. In August 1957, government agents quietly delivered the wooden casket back to the family. Workers lowered the remains into the cold stone vaults of the family crypt in Predoppio. This was the northern Italian municipality where the dictator was originally born. Predoppio holds a permanent population of roughly 6,000 local residents. Yet the burial site annually draws tens of thousands of neo-fascist visitors arriving in organized groups. The state attempted to erase a historical figure through long-term bureaucratic concealment, but the effort failed. Today, the tomb of the executed dictator operates openly as a legal tourist center.